What if the stars you see tonight are not merely distant suns burning in the void, but markers? What if they were once used as guideposts, not by astronomers peering through telescopes, but by travelers who walked beneath them, mapping routes across a world we no longer recognize? What if the patterns we call constellations are not just stories invented to pass the time, but memories encoded in light, preserving journeys taken so long ago that the very continents have shifted beneath them? There is a disquiet that comes with looking up at the night sky and realizing you may not be seeing what you think you are seeing. We have been taught that human beings learned to navigate by the stars perhaps 10,000 years ago, maybe 15. We have been told that sophisticated astronomical knowledge arose with the first civilizations, with Babylon and Egypt, with the priests who carved zodiacs into stone temples. But what if that is not when it began? What if the sky was read and mapped long before that, not as an abstract exercise in mythology, but as a literal guide across the face of a changing earth? If you find yourself drawn to the kind of history that sleeps between myth and archaeology, then stay with me. And if this resonates, then perhaps you might consider leaving a like, subscribing to join others who question the boundaries of what we have been told is knowable. Tell me where you are listening from tonight. Tell me if you have ever looked up at the stars and felt something older than memory stirring. Because tonight, we are going to explore a possibility that should not exist within the framework of accepted history. We are going to examine the idea that certain star maps, certain patterns of celestial observation embedded in myth and encoded in oral tradition, do not merely tell stories about gods and heroes. Instead, they record something far more terrestrial, far more human. They record migration. They record movement. They record the footsteps of our ancestors crossing landscapes that are now lost beneath the waves, walking routes that vanished 150,000 years ago. This is not a story about modern navigation, about sextants and compasses, about European sailors plotting courses across the Atlantic. This is a story about something far older, far stranger. This is a story about people who walked out of Africa when the world was a different shape, and who, as they walked, looked up. And what they saw, they remembered. And what they remembered, they passed down. Not in books, not in writing, but in the sky itself. Let us begin with a simple observation, one that does not fit comfortably within our models of early human cognition. There are star patterns, constellation stories, celestial narratives that appear across enormous geographic distances. They appear in the mythology of the Sand People of southern Africa. They appear in the Dreamtime stories of Aboriginal Australians. They appear in the oral traditions of Arctic peoples who have lived near the top of the world for millennia. And here is the disquieting part. These stories are not merely similar. They reference the same celestial objects, the same patterns of movement, the same narrative of a path followed by ancestors. Now, conventional anthropology explains this through diffusion, through cultural contact, through the spread of ideas along trade routes. And there is truth in that. Cultures do borrow from one another. Stories do migrate. But the star patterns we are discussing are not appearing along obvious trade routes between neighboring peoples. They are appearing in isolated populations separated by oceans, by deserts, by distances so vast that contact would seem impossible unless it occurred very, very long ago. Consider the Pleiades, that tight cluster of stars that almost every culture on Earth has named, has woven into mythology. In southern Africa, the Sand People speak of them as digging sticks thrown into the sky to mark the beginning of a journey. In Australia, Aboriginal groups describe them as women traveling, sisters moving across the land and into the sky. In the Arctic, Inuit traditions speak of them as hunters or as a group separated from the main body of travelers. Different narratives, yes, but a common thread: movement, journey, separation, path being marked. Why would isolated human populations, separated by tens of thousands of years of divergent history, all encode the idea of ancestral travel into the same cluster of stars? Is it coincidence? Is it something deeper, something hardwired into human perception? Or is it possible, just possible, that the story was already old when these populations diverged, that the journey being remembered in the stars is the original journey, the one that scattered humanity across the globe? We have been taught that early humans migrated out of Africa perhaps 70,000 years ago, maybe a bit earlier. We have been taught that they did so in small, disorganized groups, following game, following water, with no larger plan, no sophisticated understanding of geography or navigation. But the archaeological record is beginning to whisper something different. Coastal routes, now submerged, show signs of habitation far older than we expected. Genetic markers suggest waves of migration that predate the accepted models. And always, in the background, there are the myths. The stories told around fires, generation after generation, about ancestors who walked across lands that no longer exist. What if those myths are not fantasies? What if they are maps? What if the stars are the reference points and the stories are the routes? Imagine, for a moment, that you are standing on a coastline that does not exist anymore. The year, if such a concept even means anything, is perhaps 150,000 years ago. The sea level is lower. The world is cooler. The land bridges that will one day vanish beneath the rising oceans are still walkable. You are part of a small group, perhaps a few dozen individuals, and you are moving. Not aimlessly, not randomly. You are following a route that has been traveled before, a route that your parents described to you, a route that their parents described to them. But how do you remember such a route? There are no roads, no signposts. The landscape itself shifts with the seasons, with the rains, with the migrations of animals. And yet, you must remember, because if you lose the path, you lose access to water sources, to hunting grounds, to the places where flint can be found for tools, where certain plants grow. Memory becomes survival. And the most reliable memory, the memory that does not change with the seasons, is the sky. So you learn the stars. You learn them not as abstractions, not as distant curiosities, but as guides. You learn that when a particular cluster rises in the east, you turn toward the coast. You learn that when another constellation sets behind a mountain range, you follow the valley. You learn that the path of the ancestors is not just a phrase, not just a poetic metaphor. It is a literal description, preserved in the movement of the heavens, because the heavens do not forget. And here is where it becomes unsettling. Because if this is true, if early humans were using celestial navigation not 10,000 years ago but 150,000 years ago, then everything we understand about cognitive development, about the sophistication of early Homo sapiens, needs to be reconsidered. We have built our models of human evolution on the assumption that complex abstract thinking arose relatively recently. We assume that symbolic thought, that the ability to encode information in metaphor and myth, is a late development, something that emerged only after humans had already spread across much of the world. But what if it was the other way around? What if the sophistication came first, and the spreading was a result of it? What if the reason humans were able to migrate so successfully, to populate every corner of the earth, was precisely because they had already developed systems of navigation, of memory, of knowledge transmission that we are only now beginning to recognize? There is a site in southern Africa, a rock shelter called Blombo's Cave, where archaeologists have found engraved ochre pieces, abstract patterns etched into stone, dating back at least 70,000 years. These are not representational images. They are geometric, symbolic. They suggest a mind capable of abstraction, of encoding meaning in pattern. And if humans 70,000 years ago were capable of this, what were they capable of 80,000 years ago? 100,000? 150,000? The question is not whether early humans could think symbolically. The evidence is mounting that they could. The question is what they chose to encode and why. And one compelling answer is that they encoded the sky, because the sky was how they found their way home. Now let us turn our attention to something specific, something that should not be possible if the conventional timeline is correct. There are constellation patterns, recorded in the oral traditions of Aboriginal Australians, that appear to describe coastal routes. Not routes across the interior of the continent, but routes along the edge, where the sea meets the land. And when researchers have mapped these celestial narratives onto reconstructions of ancient coastlines as they existed during periods of lower sea level, the patterns align. The stories describe landmarks that are now underwater. They describe passages between land masses that are now separated by hundreds of kilometers of ocean. How is this possible? Aboriginal Australians have been in Australia for at least 65,000 years, possibly longer. The stories they tell are among the oldest continuous oral traditions on Earth. But the coastlines they describe, the routes they encode in their star myths, correspond to geographies that existed not 65,000 years ago, but much earlier. The alignment is strongest when you go back to periods of glacial maximum, when sea levels were at their lowest, when land bridges existed that have since vanished. Are we to believe that these stories have been passed down, unchanged, for over 100,000 years? That seems impossible. Oral traditions drift. They change. They are reinterpreted by each generation. And yet, the celestial markers remain. The stars do not drift. The stories attached to them may shift, may be remythologized, but the patterns themselves, the guideposts, remain fixed. Or consider the traditions of the Sami people, the indigenous inhabitants of the Arctic regions of Scandinavia. Their star lore includes references to paths taken by ancestors across ice, across land that connected regions now separated by the sea. And when you map these stories, when you trace the routes they describe using the stars as reference points, you find that they align with the geography of the last ice age, when the Barents Sea was partially exposed, when migration routes across what is now open water were feasible. Why would a people preserve such knowledge unless it was once essential? Unless it was once the difference between survival and extinction? There is a pattern emerging here, a pattern that cuts across continents, across cultures, across vast stretches of time. And the pattern is this: human beings have been encoding geographic information in celestial observation for far longer than we have been willing to admit. Not as an intellectual curiosity, not as mythology for its own sake, but as navigation, as memory, as a way to preserve the routes that made survival possible when the world was young and wild and unforgiving. Let us go deeper. Let us ask a question that makes the academic establishment uncomfortable. If early humans living 150,000 years ago or more, were capable of sophisticated celestial navigation, of encoding geographic information in star patterns, then where is the physical evidence? Where are the maps? The answer, of course, is that we are looking in the wrong places, expecting the wrong forms. We expect maps to look like maps, to be drawn on skins or carved into stone, to have clear markers of longitude and latitude. But what if a map does not need to be a physical object? What if a map can be a story? What if it can be a song? Indigenous Australian songlines are among the most remarkable examples of this. These are oral narratives, passed down through generations, that describe journeys across the landscape. They tell you where to find water, where to find food, where the dangerous places are. And they do so not through written directions, not through diagrams, but through rhythm, through melody, through story. The landscape itself becomes mnemonic, encoded in the structure of the song. And interwoven with these terrestrial directions are celestial references, stars that mark the seasons, that indicate when certain routes are passable, when certain resources will be available. These song lines are maps. They are functional, usable maps. And some of them describe geographies that no longer exist. They describe rivers that have dried up, coastlines that have shifted, islands that are now submerged. The songs remember what the land has forgotten. Now, if Aboriginal Australians developed this system, and if it encodes information about landscapes that vanished at the end of the last ice age, then the system itself must be older than the last ice age. It must predate the flooding. It must have been created when those landscapes were still accessible, still relevant. And if it is that old, then it raises a possibility that should give us pause. The possibility that this was not a system invented in Australia. The possibility that it was brought to Australia. Brought by the first migrants, carried in their minds as they walked across land bridges that would soon disappear beneath the rising seas. And if it was carried to Australia, then it must have existed before the journey to Australia began. It must have been developed somewhere else, somewhere earlier. Perhaps in Africa. Perhaps along the coasts of southern Asia. Perhaps in places we have not yet identified because the evidence is now 100 meters below the surface of the ocean. The problem with studying deep history, history that extends beyond the reach of written records, is that our evidence is fragmented. The coastlines where early humans lived, the places where they would have built shelters, developed cultures, passed down knowledge, those places are gone. 70% of the human population, even today, lives within 100 kilometers of the coast. Imagine how much more pronounced that would have been in the deep past, when coastal environments offered abundant resources, easy travel, and access to marine foods that could support larger populations. All of that is underwater now. The sites we can excavate are only the ones that happen to be inland, that happen to survive the flooding. We are studying the remnants, the periphery, and trying to extrapolate the core. But the myths survive. The oral traditions survive. And the stars, always the stars remain. There is a particular constellation pattern that appears in the mythology of the Sand People of southern Africa. It involves the Milky Way, the dense band of stars that stretches across the sky, and a specific arrangement of brighter stars that the San associate with a bridge, a pathway, a route taken by the first people. The story describes a journey out of a place of hardship, across a bridge of stars, to new lands. It is a migration myth like so many others. But here is the interesting part. When astronomers map the position of the Milky Way as it would have appeared from southern Africa during different periods of the past, during different epochs of Earth's axial precession, the alignment described in the sand myth does not correspond to the recent past. It does not correspond to 10,000 years ago, or 20,000, or even 50,000. The alignment is most accurate, most precise when you go back further. Much further. The Earth's axis wobbles over a cycle of approximately 26,000 years. This wobble, called precession, means that the position of the stars relative to the horizon shifts slowly over millennia. The North Star has not always been the North Star. The constellations rise and set at different times of the year depending on where you are in the precessional cycle. And if a myth encodes a specific celestial alignment, you can, in theory, date the origin of that myth by calculating when the alignment was accurate. When researchers have done this with certain sand star myths, the dates that emerge are staggering. Not 20,000 years, not 50,000, but older. Dates that push back into periods when, according to conventional archaeology, humans in southern Africa were not supposed to be engaging in complex symbolic thought, were not supposed to be encoding astronomical observations, were not supposed to be doing anything more sophisticated than basic tool-making and survival. And yet, the stars remember, the stories remember, and they are whispering a different timeline, a timeline in which human cognition, human culture, human sophistication is far older than we have been willing to accept. This is not proof. Let us be clear about that. This is not incontrovertible evidence that will rewrite the textbooks tomorrow. But it is a thread. It is a question. It is a disquiet that settles over you when you realize that the official history, the accepted narrative, may be built on incomplete data, on fragments pulled from the edges of a story whose center is lost beneath the waves. Now let us turn our attention to the Arctic, to the far north, where the conditions for preserving oral traditions are, paradoxically, quite favorable. The Arctic environment is harsh, unforgiving, and it demands that knowledge be transmitted with precision. A mistake in navigation, a misremembering of where the hunting grounds are or where the ice is safe, can mean death. And so, Arctic peoples have developed oral traditions that are remarkably stable, remarkably resistant to drift, because inaccuracy is lethal. The Inuit, the Yupik, the Sami, the various peoples who have inhabited the circumpolar regions for thousands of years, all possess star lore that is deeply intertwined with navigation. This is not surprising. In the Arctic, during the long winter nights, the stars are often the only reliable reference points. The landscape is white, featureless, erased by snow. The sun does not rise for months. And yet people traveled. They hunted. They found their way across hundreds of kilometers of ice and tundra. How? By reading the sky. But here is where it becomes strange. The Inuit star maps, the celestial navigation systems they use, include references to land features, to geographic markers, that do not exist in the current Arctic landscape. They describe coastlines that are different from the ones we see today. They describe islands, passages, routes across areas that are now open water, now inaccessible except by boat during the brief summer months. When glaciologists and archaeologists have mapped these descriptions, when they have attempted to reconcile the Inuit star stories with actual geography, they have found that the best fit, the most accurate correspondence, is with the Arctic as it existed during the Younger Dryas, a period of intense cold that ended roughly 11,500 years ago. During this time, sea levels were lower, ice coverage was more extensive, and certain land bridges and coastal routes were available that have since vanished. The conventional explanation is that the Inuit arrived in the Arctic relatively recently, perhaps a few thousand years ago, and that their star lore developed after their arrival, based on the geography they encountered. But this does not explain the anomalies. It does not explain why their stories describe features that were gone long before they arrived. Unless, of course, the stories are older than the people currently telling them. Unless the stories were inherited from an earlier population, a population that lived in the Arctic when those land features still existed, and whose knowledge was absorbed, preserved, passed down by the groups that came later. This is a phenomenon we see repeatedly in oral traditions around the world. Layers, stratification, stories that seem to contain information from multiple time periods, woven together, sometimes coherently, sometimes in fragments. It is as if the oral tradition is a palimpsest, a manuscript that has been written over and over, but where the earlier texts, the earlier knowledge, still bleeds through if you know how to look. And the stars are the key because the stars provide an external, objective reference point. You can mythologize them, you can reinterpret them, but their positions, their movements are fixed by the laws of physics. And if a story describes a specific celestial alignment, and that alignment corresponds to a specific historical period, then the story, at some level, must originate from that period. It may have been altered, it may have been embellished, but the core, the navigational data, remains. Let us consider another example, one that has troubled researchers for decades. In the mythology of certain Pacific Island cultures, there are stories of a great journey, a migration across vast distances of ocean, guided by the stars. This is well documented. Polynesian navigators were, and remain, among the most skilled seafarers in human history. They colonized islands separated by thousands of kilometers of open water, using only the stars, the currents, the flight patterns of birds. This is accepted. This is known. But some of the star patterns they reference, some of the celestial waypoints described in their navigational chants, correspond to routes that are far longer than the distances between the islands they settled. They describe journeys that, if taken literally, would extend back to the Asian mainland, back to coastlines that, when mapped, align best with periods of lower sea level with the geography of the last glacial maximum. Why would Polynesians, who settled the Pacific Islands within the last few thousand years, possess navigational knowledge that describes routes from a much earlier period? The standard explanation is that the knowledge was carried forward from their ancestors, who migrated out of Southeast Asia over many generations. But this pushes the origin of the knowledge back, further and further, until you are confronted with a possibility that feels almost impossible. The possibility that the navigational system, the star maps, the encoding of routes in celestial patterns, was already old when the first Polynesians set out across the Pacific. Already ancient, already a memory of earlier journeys, earlier migrations, taken by people whose names are lost, whose cultures have vanished, but whose knowledge endured. This is what we mean when we say the stars remember. The stars are a constant. They are a repository of information that transcends any individual culture, any single population. And if you encode knowledge in the stars, if you tie your survival to the patterns you see above you, then that knowledge can persist far longer than any physical artifact, longer than any written record, because it is not dependent on preservation of material. It is dependent only on the preservation of memory. And human memory, human oral tradition, when properly maintained, when tied to survival, can be remarkably, unsettlingly deep. Let us now consider a question that has been lurking beneath the surface of this inquiry from the beginning. If we accept, even provisionally, that some star maps encode migration routes from 150,000 years ago, then we must ask, who were the mapmakers? Who were the people sophisticated enough, organized enough, cognitively capable enough, to develop and maintain such a system? The conventional answer is that they were anatomically modern humans, Homo sapiens, who had already emerged in Africa and were beginning the slow process of dispersal that would eventually take them to every corner of the globe. And this is, by all current evidence, the most likely answer. But it raises a disquieting corollary. If Homo sapiens 150,000 years ago were capable of this level of abstract thought, of symbolic encoding, of long-term knowledge transmission, then the gap between them and us, cognitively speaking, may be far smaller than we have assumed. We tend to think of early humans as primitive, as fundamentally different from ourselves in their mental capacities. We imagine them as creatures of instinct, of immediate survival, without the capacity for planning, for abstraction, for the kind of cumulative cultural knowledge that characterizes modern civilization. But the evidence, when you look closely, does not support this. The evidence suggests that early Homo sapiens were, in their raw cognitive potential, quite similar to us. What they lacked was not intelligence, but time, population density, and perhaps most importantly, stable environmental conditions that allowed for the accumulation of knowledge. Because here is the thing about knowledge. It is fragile, can be lost. A single catastrophic event, a volcanic eruption, a rapid climate shift, a plague, can wipe out entire populations and, with them, generations of accumulated learning. The miracle is not that early humans knew so little. The miracle is that they managed to preserve anything at all across the vast stretches of time, across the repeated bottlenecks and near extinctions that the genetic record tells us they endured. And if they chose to encode their most essential knowledge in the stars, that is not because they were superstitious or because they lacked better methods. It is because the stars were the most stable, most reliable medium available. The stars do not burn. They do not rot. They do not get washed away in floods or buried in volcanic ash. They are always there, always observable, always constant within the span of human lifetimes. If you need to transmit information across generations, across migrations, across catastrophes, then the sky is the most logical place to encode it. This is why we find such remarkable consistency in celestial observation across disparate cultures. It is not because they all independently decided that stars were interesting. It is because they all inherited fragments of a system that was once, perhaps, far more widespread, far more unified, but which fragmented as populations dispersed, as languages diverged, as cultures evolved in isolation. Imagine a single origin point, perhaps in Africa, where early humans first began to systematically observe the sky, to connect specific star patterns with specific geographic features, with specific migratory routes. As populations moved outward, they carried this knowledge with them. But over tens of thousands of years, as groups became isolated from one another, as local conditions varied, the system would naturally diverge. Different populations would emphasize different constellations, would attach different stories, different meanings. And yet, the underlying structure, the core logic of using celestial patterns as navigational and mnemonic devices, would persist. This is what we may be seeing in the global distribution of star lore. Not independent invention, not coincidence, but the fragmented remnants of a once unified system, a system so old that its origins have been forgotten, but whose utility ensured that pieces of it survived, embedded in the oral traditions of peoples scattered across the entire planet. Now, let us consider the land bridges. During the last glacial maximum, which peaked around 20,000 years ago but which encompassed multiple periods of lower sea level extending back over 100,000 years, vast areas of the continental shelves were exposed. The Bering Land Bridge, connecting Siberia and Alaska, is well known. But there were others. Sundaland, the exposed shelf connecting the islands of Southeast Asia into a single landmass. Sahul, the combined continent of Australia and New Guinea. The Persian Gulf, which was a dry, habitable valley. The Red Sea, which was narrower, shallower, with multiple potential crossing points. The Mediterranean, with land bridges connecting North Africa and southern Europe at various points. These were not barren wastelands. Paleo-environmental reconstructions suggest that many of these exposed areas were rich in resources, well-watered, supporting diverse ecosystems. They were, in many cases, ideal habitats for early human populations. And they were the routes, the highways along which migrations occurred. But they are gone now. They have been submerged for 10, 12, 15,000 years, depending on the location. And with them, the physical evidence of the people who lived there, who walked those routes, who may have developed the sophisticated cultures whose echoes we are now beginning to detect in the oral traditions of their distant descendants. This is the central frustration of deep history. The places we most need to study are inaccessible. Underwater archaeology is expensive, difficult, and in many cases, legally and politically complicated. We have explored perhaps 1% of the submerged continental shelves, perhaps less, and even when we do find sites, they are degraded, washed away, their organic materials long since decayed. We get stone tools, sometimes hearths, occasionally burials. But the artifacts that would tell us about their knowledge systems, their social structures, their beliefs, those are gone. Except, perhaps, in the stories. Except, perhaps, in the stars. There is a particular region that demands our attention, a region that has been called the cradle of civilization but which may, in fact, be something else entirely. Place of return. Place of remembrance. We are speaking of the area surrounding the Persian Gulf, the lands that became Sumer, the region where, according to the accepted narrative, writing and cities and complex societies first emerged around 5,500 years ago. But the Persian Gulf was not always a gulf. During periods of lower sea level, it was a river valley, a lush, well-watered basin fed by the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. It was, by all reconstructions, an ideal habitat for human populations. And it was inhabited. Archaeological sites on the periphery, on the highlands surrounding what is now the Gulf, show continuous human presence extending back tens of thousands of years. And then, as the ice melted, as the seas rose, the valley flooded. Slowly at first, then more rapidly during certain periods of accelerated sea level rise. By around 8,000 years ago, the Persian Gulf had reached approximately its current configuration. The river valley was gone. The settlements that had existed there, if there were any, were submerged. Now here is the interesting part. The Sumerian creation myths, the earliest narratives we have from that region, speak of a time before the flood, of cities that existed before the rise of the waters, of knowledge that was preserved and brought up from the depths. They speak of the Abzu, the primordial abyss, the watery deep, as a place of knowledge, of wisdom, of the secrets of civilization. And they speak of sages, of figures called the Apkallu, who brought knowledge from the Abzu to the people, who taught them the arts of civilization. Orthodox scholars interpret this as mythology, as religious symbolism, as a way of explaining the origins of their culture in terms that made sense within their cosmology. And they are not wrong. Mythology is always symbolic. It is always layered with meaning. But what if there is also a historical kernel? What if the Sumerians were remembering, however dimly, however mythologized, an actual event? The flooding of the Gulf, the loss of older settlements, and the preservation and transmission of knowledge from before the flood. This is not a new idea. It has been proposed before, usually by fringe theorists, and usually dismissed by mainstream academia. But recent underwater surveys in the Persian Gulf have begun to uncover evidence that is harder to dismiss. Stone tools, shell middens, structural anomalies that may indicate human habitation. Nothing conclusive yet. Nothing that proves the existence of a sophisticated pre-flood culture. But enough to suggest that the Gulf Basin was indeed inhabited, and that those settlements were indeed lost to the rising waters. And if there were settlements, then there were people. And if there were people living in an environment that was stable, resource-rich for thousands of years before the flooding, then those people would have developed culture, knowledge, technologies adapted to their environment. And when the waters rose, when they were forced to relocate to the highlands, to the edges of what had once been their homeland, they would have carried that knowledge with them. Is it possible that what we call the Sumerian civilization was not a beginning, but a continuation? A restoration? An attempt to rebuild what had been lost? The Sumerians themselves seem to have believed this. Their king lists speak of kingship being lowered from heaven after the flood, as if there had been kingship before, but it had been interrupted, submerged, and then restored. Their myths speak of knowledge being recovered from the Abzu, from the watery depths. They speak of themselves not as innovators, but as inheritors. And if the Sumerians were inheriting knowledge, then from whom? From people who lived in the Gulf Basin before the flood. And if those people had knowledge sophisticated enough to be worth preserving, worth passing down, then how far back does that knowledge extend? If the Gulf Basin was inhabited continuously for tens of thousands of years before the flooding, then the knowledge could be very old indeed. And if that knowledge included celestial navigation, the encoding of geographic information in star patterns, then it could connect directly to the migration routes we have been discussing, routes that were walked not 5,000 years ago, not 10,000, but 50, 100, 150,000 years ago. This is speculation. Let us be clear. But it is informed speculation, grounded in the recognition that our picture of deep history is incomplete, that vast stretches of the human story are inaccessible to us, hidden beneath the waves, and that the oral traditions, the myths, the astronomical knowledge embedded in ancient cultures may be one of the few remaining windows into that lost world. Now, let us return to the stars. Let us consider a specific constellation pattern that appears with variations in the mythologies of Africa, the Middle East, and Australia. It involves a particular arrangement of bright stars that forms what we might call a pointer, a directional marker. In southern Africa, the San people associate this pattern with a specific direction of travel, with a route taken by the first ancestors out of a land of hardship. In the Middle East, in the astronomical traditions that predate even the Sumerians, there are references to this same pattern as marking a sacred direction, a path toward a place of origin. And in Australia, the pattern appears in song lines that describe coastal routes, routes along the edge of the continent, routes that lead ultimately out of Australia, back toward the west, back toward the source. Is this coincidence? Is this independent invention? Or is this a memory, fragmented, distorted, but preserved across unimaginable spans of time and distance, of an actual route? A route that connected Africa, the Arabian Peninsula, the Indian subcontinent, and eventually Australia. A route that was walked, not once, but repeatedly, over tens of thousands of years, by populations moving back and forth, mixing, diverging, but always following the same celestial guideposts. The genetic evidence suggests that such movements did occur. Modern humans did migrate out of Africa along coastal routes, did populate the Arabian Peninsula, did reach India and Southeast Asia, did eventually arrive in Australia. But the genetic evidence gives us only shadows, only patterns of relationship. It does not tell us how they navigated. It does not tell us how they remembered the routes. It does not tell us what they knew. But the stars might. There is a concept in archaeology and anthropology called cultural memory, the idea that societies preserve knowledge not only through written records but through oral tradition, through ritual, through the very structure of their languages and myths. And cultural memory can be very deep, deeper than we once thought possible. We now know, for example, that Aboriginal Australian oral traditions contain accurate descriptions of volcanic eruptions that occurred over 7,000 years ago. They describe the formation of specific geographic features, the flooding of specific areas, events that can be corroborated through geological evidence and radiocarbon dating. These are not vague, mythologized stories. They are precise, factual accounts, passed down through hundreds of generations, preserved with remarkable accuracy. If oral traditions can preserve accurate geographic and climatic information for 7,000 years, then how far back can they go? 10,000? 20? Could they, under the right circumstances, extend even further? Could they reach back to the migrations we have been discussing, migrations that occurred not thousands but tens or even hundreds of thousands of years ago? The answer, increasingly, is that we cannot rule it out. We cannot assume that just because something seems impossibly old, it cannot have been preserved. Memory is not bound by the same constraints as physical artifacts. Memory is copied, refreshed, retold with each generation. And as long as the memory serves a function, as long as it conveys knowledge that is useful, that enhances survival or social cohesion, it will be maintained. And celestial navigation is useful. It is profoundly useful. Even in the modern world, with GPS and satellites, understanding the sky, understanding how to orient yourself by the stars, remains a valuable skill. For early humans, it would have been essential. And if the knowledge of how to read the stars, how to use them as a map, was already old when our species first began to disperse across the planet, then that knowledge would have been carried forward generation after generation because it worked, because it saved lives, because it enabled the journeys that eventually populated the entire Earth. Now let us turn to a specific example that brings all of this into sharp focus. In the highlands of Ethiopia, there is a region called the Bale Mountains. It is a remote, high-altitude area, one of the few places in Africa where you can still experience an environment relatively untouched by modernity. And it is a place that has been inhabited, continuously, for at least 40,000 years, possibly much longer. Obsidian tools found in the region have been dated using various methods, and they show a pattern of continuous occupation extending back into the deep past. The people who live in the Bale Mountains today, the Aramo people, possess oral traditions that describe the stars, that use the sky as a calendar, as a guide for seasonal movements, for knowing when to plant, when to harvest, when to move livestock to higher pastures. This is common. Agricultural and pastoral societies around the world use the stars for this purpose. But the Aramo traditions go further. They describe specific star patterns that, they say, mark the paths taken by the ancestors, the routes out of the mountains and down to the lowlands, the routes to the coast. And when researchers have mapped these descriptions, when they have attempted to trace the routes using the stars as guideposts, they have found something remarkable. The routes described in the Aramo star lore do not correspond to the current geography. They describe coastlines, river systems, passages through terrain that has since been altered by tectonic activity, by climate shifts, by the slow reshaping of the landscape over tens of thousands of years. The best fit, the most accurate correspondence, is with the geography as it existed during the last glacial period, when sea levels were lower, when the Red Sea was narrower, when the Arabian Peninsula and the Horn of Africa were more closely connected. This is a pattern we have seen before. The stories remember what the land has forgotten. The stars preserve what the earth has erased. But here is where it becomes truly unsettling. The genetic evidence suggests that the Horn of Africa, the region that includes Ethiopia, Somalia, Eritrea, was a major source population for the migrations out of Africa. Modern humans living in the Middle East, in India, in Europe, in East Asia all carry genetic signatures that trace back, at least in part, to populations that originated in or near the Horn of Africa. This region was, in a very real sense, one of the launching points for the global dispersal of our species. And if the people living in this region possessed sophisticated celestial navigation, if they encoded their migration routes in star patterns, then those patterns, that knowledge, would have been carried with them as they dispersed. It would have spread, adapted, modified by each new population, but the core logic, the core method, would persist. And that is exactly what we see. We see star lore, celestial navigation systems that share common elements across Africa, across the Arabian Peninsula, across India, across Southeast Asia, across Australia. Not identical, but connected, related, as if they all stem from a common source, a common method, developed long ago and carried across the world by the people who walked beneath those stars. This is not proof. I cannot emphasize this enough. This is a hypothesis, a model, a way of interpreting disparate pieces of evidence that do not fit comfortably within the conventional narrative. But it is a testable hypothesis. As we develop better methods for analyzing oral traditions, as we conduct more underwater archaeology, as we refine our genetic and paleoclimatic models, we will be able to determine whether this idea holds water. We will be able to see whether the star maps truly do record the ancient migrations, or whether this is simply a case of seeing patterns where none exist, of reading too much into coincidence. But for now, sitting here in the dark, looking up at the same stars that our ancestors looked up at 150,000 years ago, it is difficult not to feel that there is something there. Something real. Something that has been waiting for us to notice, to question, to remember. Let us consider the practicalities of celestial navigation, because understanding how it works will help us appreciate what it means for early humans to have possessed this knowledge. The sky, from any given point on Earth, is a rotating sphere. The stars rise in the east, arc across the sky, and set in the west. But not all stars participate in this motion equally. Near the poles, there are stars that never set, stars that circle the celestial pole without ever dipping below the horizon. These are called circumpolar stars, and they are the most reliable navigational markers because they are always visible, always in the same relative position. In the northern hemisphere, the most famous circumpolar star is Polaris, the North Star. But Polaris has not always been the North Star. Because of the Earth's axial precession, the position of the celestial pole shifts over a 26,000-year cycle. 5,000 years ago, the pole was closer to the star Thuban. 12,000 years ago, it was near Vega. And in another 12,000 years, it will be near Vega again. The sky is not as constant as it seems within a single human lifetime. Over millennia, it changes. But the changes are predictable. They follow patterns. And if you observe the sky carefully over many generations, if you track the movements of the stars, you can begin to understand the patterns, to predict them, to use them not just for navigation in the present but to orient yourself in time, to connect your observations to those of your ancestors, to verify that the knowledge being passed down is accurate. This is what sophisticated celestial navigation requires. Not just observation, but multi-generational observation. Not just memory, but collective memory. A culture must be stable enough, must have a reason to preserve the knowledge, must have systems for training the young, for passing the information forward without corruption. And such systems do exist. They have always existed. The navigators of Polynesia trained for years, learning to read not just the stars but the ocean swells, the cloud patterns, the flight of birds. The knowledge was sacred, guarded, passed down within specific lineages. And it worked. They crossed thousands of kilometers of open ocean and found islands no larger than specks, because their navigational knowledge was precise, accumulated over many generations, encoded in chants and rituals that ensured accuracy. If Polynesians could do this within the last few thousand years, why could early Homo sapiens not have done something similar 50,000, 100,000, 150,000 years ago? The cognitive capacity was there. The need was certainly there. The only question is whether the cultural stability existed, whether populations were organized enough, socially cohesive enough, to maintain such systems over the necessary timescales. And the evidence, fragmentary as it is, suggests that they were. The genetic data shows repeated contacts between distant populations, suggesting established routes, regular travel, not just one-way migrations but back-and-forth movement. The archaeological record, where it exists, shows trade goods moving over enormous distances, obsidian from specific sources being found hundreds of kilometers away, marine shells being carried inland, suggesting networks, connections, relationships that spanned vast geographic areas. These are not the behaviors of isolated, disorganized bands scraping out a marginal existence. These are the behaviors of people who were connected, who traveled, who maintained relationships across distance. And maintaining such relationships requires navigation. It requires knowing where you are going. It requires maps. Now, let us address a question that often arises when these ideas are discussed. If early humans possessed such sophisticated knowledge, then why did it take so long for civilization, as we understand it, to arise? Why did writing, cities, agriculture, all the trappings of what we call civilization, not appear until relatively recently, until the last 10 or 12,000 years? The answer lies in understanding what civilization actually requires. Civilization is not just knowledge. It is not just intelligence. Civilization requires surplus. It requires population density. It requires stable environmental conditions that allow for the accumulation of resources, for specialization of labor, for the development of social hierarchies. And for most of human history, those conditions did not exist. The climate was unstable, oscillating wildly between glacial and interglacial periods. Sea levels rose and fell. Droughts came and went. Populations were small, scattered, mobile. There was no opportunity to build cities, to develop writing, because survival itself was precarious. The knowledge was there. The capacity was there. But the circumstances were not. And when the climate finally stabilized, when the Holocene began around 12,000 years ago, when the wild oscillations of the Pleistocene came to an end, then, and only then, did the conditions exist for civilization to emerge. And when it emerged, it did so remarkably quickly. Within a few thousand years, we go from hunter-gatherers to cities, to writing, to monumental architecture. Why so fast? Because the knowledge, the accumulated understanding of agriculture, of animal domestication, of social organization, was already there, waiting. It had been preserved, perhaps, in the oral traditions, in the practices of peoples who had been waiting for the world to become stable enough to put that knowledge into action. This is what we mean by restoration, by remembrance. The Sumerians spoke of their civilization as a restoration of what had been before. The Egyptians spoke of Zep-Tepi, the first time, an earlier age of perfection to which they were always trying to return. The Hindus speak of cycles, of yugas, of ages of knowledge that were lost and must be recovered. These are not just myths. They are, perhaps, cultural memories of real knowledge, real sophistication, that existed in the deep past but which could not be fully expressed because the world was not stable enough, not conducive enough, to support the kind of large-scale, settled societies that we call civilizations. Let us return once more to the land bridges, because they are the key to understanding how these migrations could have occurred, how routes could have been established, how knowledge could have been transmitted across such vast distances. The Bering Land Bridge is the most famous, the route by which humans entered the Americas. But its existence was relatively brief, geologically speaking, and it was available only during specific periods of maximum glaciation. If you were not crossing during those windows, you were not crossing at all. But other land bridges, other coastal routes were more persistent. The exposed continental shelves of Southeast Asia, the Sunda Shelf, remained above water for much longer periods. The route along the coast of India, down through what is now the Bay of Bengal past Sri Lanka, and on to Southeast Asia was available at least in part for tens of thousands of years. And these were not barren, hostile environments. They were coastlines, and coastlines are among the most productive habitats on Earth. Estuaries, tide pools, mangrove forests. These are environments rich in resources, easy to exploit, capable of supporting significant human populations. And yet they are gone. The Sunda Shelf was flooded between 15 and 8,000 years ago. The coastal plains of India were submerged. The land bridges that connected the islands of Indonesia vanished. And with them, any evidence of the people who lived there. We know they existed because the genetic and archaeological evidence from the highlands, from the islands that remained above water, shows that the region was populated. But we do not know what their cultures were like, what languages they spoke, what knowledge they possessed. We have only the shadows, the remnants, the fragments that survived in the oral traditions of the peoples who came after. And those fragments, when examined closely, suggest something remarkable. They suggest that the people living on these now submerged coastlines were not primitive, not unsophisticated. They were navigators. They were traders. They built boats. They crossed open water. They maintained contact with populations hundreds of kilometers away. And they used the stars to guide them. There is a linguistic clue here that is worth noting. The Austronesian language family, which includes the languages spoken across the Pacific Islands, from Madagascar to Easter Island, is one of the most widespread language families on Earth. And at its core, embedded in the deepest, most ancient layers of the vocabulary, are words related to navigation, to seafaring, to the stars. Words that are not borrowed, not recent innovations, but part of the foundational lexicon, suggesting that seafaring, celestial navigation, was central to the culture of the Proto-Austronesians, the ancestral population from which this language family descended. And where did the Proto-Austronesians come from? The linguistic and genetic evidence points to Taiwan, to the coasts of southern China, to the regions that were adjacent to Sundaland before it flooded. The implication is that the Proto-Austronesians, or their ancestors, were part of the populations living on the Sunda Shelf, and when the shelf flooded, they moved, carrying their languages, their navigational knowledge, their star lore with them. Some went north to Taiwan, to the Philippines. Others went east, eventually populating the Pacific. And wherever they went, they carried the stars. This is not speculative. The linguistic and genetic evidence is solid. What is speculative is the age of the navigational knowledge, the possibility that the celestial mapping system embedded in Austronesian star lore is far older than the Austronesian language family itself, that it was inherited from earlier populations that lived on Sundaland before the flooding, or perhaps even earlier, from populations that walked the coastal routes from Africa to Southeast Asia, populations that were already using the stars to navigate, already encoding their routes in the sky. If this is true, then the star lore we see scattered across Africa, across the Middle East, across India, across Southeast Asia, across the Pacific, and even across Australia, is not a collection of independent inventions. It is a single ancient system, fragmented by time, by distance, by the diversification of languages and cultures, but still recognizable, still connected, if you know how to look. Now let us consider the role of cataclysm, because it is impossible to discuss deep human history without acknowledging that our species has endured repeated catastrophes. The Toba supervolcanic eruption, 74,000 years ago, which may have reduced the global human population to as few as 10,000 individuals. The rapid sea level rise at the end of the last ice age, which flooded coastal settlements and forced mass migrations. The Younger Dryas impact event, if it occurred, which would have caused widespread destruction and climate disruption. And countless smaller events, droughts, floods, earthquakes, that we know occurred because we see their signatures in the geological and paleoclimatic records. Each of these events would have been a bottleneck, a filter, through which only certain knowledge, certain practices, certain populations could pass. And yet, humanity survived. We survived because we were adaptable. We survived because we had knowledge. We survived because we could navigate, could find new territories, could remember the routes, could transmit the information that allowed us to move, to relocate, to start again. And the most resilient knowledge, the knowledge that had the best chance of surviving a catastrophe, would be the knowledge encoded not in fragile materials, not in structures or artifacts that could be destroyed, but in memory, in oral tradition, in the sky. You cannot destroy the stars. You cannot burn them. You cannot flood them. They are always there. And if your survival knowledge is tied to the stars, then even if everything else is lost, you can rebuild. You can remember. This, perhaps, is the ultimate explanation for why celestial navigation, why star lore, is so widespread, so deeply embedded in human cultures around the world. It is not just useful. It is the most catastrophe-resistant form of knowledge transmission available to a pre-literate society. It is the backup system, the failsafe, the knowledge that endures when everything else has been swept away. We are nearing the end of this journey, this exploration of what the stars might remember. But before we conclude, let us address the skepticism, the objections, the reasons why mainstream academia has been reluctant to embrace these ideas. The first objection is the lack of direct evidence. We do not have ancient maps, inscribed on durable materials, showing migration routes and annotated with celestial reference points. We do not have written records from 150,000 years ago explaining how early humans used the stars. The evidence we have is indirect, circumstantial, based on correlations between oral traditions, astronomical alignments, and reconstructed geographies. And indirect evidence is always weaker than direct evidence. It is always subject to alternative interpretations. This is a fair criticism. The burden of proof is on those proposing the hypothesis. But we must also acknowledge the limitations of direct evidence when studying periods so remote. Writing did not exist. Durable materials were scarce. The coastlines where these populations lived are underwater. The absence of direct evidence does not mean the absence of the phenomenon. It may simply mean that we are looking in the wrong places, or that the evidence we seek is not the kind that survives geological timescales. The second objection is the problem of cultural drift. Oral traditions change. They evolve. They are influenced by new experiences, by contact with other cultures, by the need to remain relevant to successive generations. How can we trust that a story told today reflects anything accurate about events 150,000 years ago? How can we distinguish genuine ancient information from later accretions, from mythologization, from simple error? This is a more substantial challenge. And the answer is that we cannot, not with absolute certainty. But we can look for patterns. We can look for elements that are consistent across multiple, isolated traditions. We can look for information that is verifiable, such as descriptions of geographic features that can be dated, or astronomical alignments that correspond to specific time periods. And we can approach the oral traditions not as literal, factual accounts, but as repositories of information, as archives that contain a mix of accurate data, symbolic interpretation, and later innovation, and our task is to learn how to read them, how to extract the signal from the noise. The third objection is the cognitive one. Were early humans really capable of this level of sophistication? Could they develop and maintain complex systems of knowledge transmission over such timescales? The history of evolutionary psychology is full of examples where we have underestimated our ancestors, where we have assumed that certain capacities arose more recently than they actually did. And each time, as new evidence has emerged, we have had to revise our estimates upward. Language, art, symbolic thought, all of these have been pushed further back in time as new discoveries have been made. There is no reason, no principled reason, to assume that early Homo sapiens 150,000 years ago were fundamentally less intelligent, less capable of abstract thought, than Homo sapiens 10,000 years ago or today. The difference was not cognitive. The difference was circumstantial, environmental, demographic. They had fewer people. They had less stable conditions. They had fewer opportunities to accumulate and transmit knowledge across generations. But when those opportunities existed, when conditions allowed, the evidence suggests they were capable of remarkable things. So where does this leave us? What are we to make of these unsettling possibilities, these fragmentary hints that the stars might remember journeys taken long before history began? The honest answer is that we do not know. Not yet. The hypothesis is plausible. It is consistent with what we know about human cognitive capacities, about the distribution of oral traditions, about the geographies of the past. But it is not proven. It remains a question, a mystery, an invitation to look more closely, to ask deeper questions, to refuse to accept the boundaries of the official narrative as the limits of what is knowable. And perhaps that is enough. Perhaps the value of ideas like this is not that they provide final answers, but that they open new avenues of inquiry, that they remind us that history, deep history, is not a closed book, that there are still questions to ask, still mysteries to explore, still pieces of the puzzle that we have not yet found. Because here is the thing about the past. It is not really past. It is present in our genes. It is present in our languages. It is present in the stories we tell, in the structures we build, in the way we navigate, the way we think, the way we look up at the night sky and feel something stirring, some deep, inarticulate recognition. We are the inheritors. We carry within us the accumulated experiences of every generation that came before, stretching back not just centuries but millennia, not just millennia but hundreds of thousands of years, back to the very emergence of our species, and perhaps even further, back to the ancestors we shared with other hominins, other branches of the human family that are now extinct but whose genes, whose knowledge, whose experiences are still, in some sense, present within us. And if those ancestors looked up at the stars, if they used the sky to navigate, to remember, to transmit the knowledge that allowed them to survive and to spread across the entire planet, then we owe them something. We owe them the effort to remember, to reconstruct, to piece together the fragmentary evidence they left behind and to honor the sophistication, the ingenuity, the resilience they displayed. This is not about proving ourselves superior to our ancestors. It is about recognizing that they were not inferior to us, that they were us, that the distance between them and us is an illusion created by time, by the accumulated layers of technology and social complexity that make the modern world seem so different from theirs. But strip those away and we are the same hopes, the same fears, the same drive to explore, to understand, to map the world and to find our place within it. Let us imagine one final time that we could travel back. Not in a machine, not in some fantasy of temporal displacement, but in our minds, in our capacity to empathize, to project ourselves into the experience of someone who lived 150,000 years ago. You are standing on a beach. The sea is lower than it is now. The horizon is further away. The coastline curves differently. Behind you, the land rises toward hills that are greener, more heavily forested than they will be in the future, because the climate is different, the rainfall patterns are different. You are with your family, with your group, perhaps 30 people, perhaps fewer. You have been walking for days, following a route that your elders described to you, a route that their elders described to them. You do not have a map. You do not have written directions. But you have the stars. And you have the stories that tell you when a certain cluster of stars rises above the eastern horizon, you turn inland and follow the river. The stories that tell you when another constellation sets behind the mountains, you have reached the place where the freshwater springs can be found. The stories that tell you if you keep the bright star on your left shoulder as you walk at night, you will reach the crossing point by dawn. These stories are not entertainment. They are not idle speculation. They are survival. They are the accumulated knowledge of generations, tested and refined through lived experience, through trial and error, through the deaths of those who forgot or who misremembered or who did not pay attention. And because they are survival, they are transmitted with care, with ritual, with repetition. The young are taught to look up, to recognize the patterns, to connect the sky with the land. And when they have children, they will teach them the same. You do not think of yourself as doing anything remarkable. You are simply living, simply moving, simply following the path that has always been followed. But you are, in fact, engaged in an act of profound cognitive complexity. You are using abstract symbols, points of light in the sky, to represent concrete geographic features on the ground. You are encoding spatial information in a form that transcends the immediate, the visible, the tangible. You are thinking symbolically. You are thinking temporally, connecting past knowledge to present action to future survival. You are, in every meaningful sense, fully human. And the route you are walking, the route your ancestors walked, is not random. It follows the coast because the coast is productive, because the resources are abundant, because the travel is easier along the flat coastal plains than through the rugged interior. And it connects, eventually, to other routes, routes that lead inland to highland refuges during times of flooding, routes that lead across land bridges to new continents, routes that will, over tens of thousands of years, carry your descendants to every corner of the earth. You do not know this. You cannot know this. Your world is immediate, local, bounded by the distance you can walk in a lifetime. But the knowledge you carry, the star patterns you have memorized, the routes encoded in those patterns, they are part of a larger system, a web of knowledge that extends far beyond your individual experience, that connects you to people you will never meet, who lived before you were born, who will live after you are gone. This is what it means to be part of a culture. This is what it means to inherit. Not just genes, not just physical traits, but knowledge, practices, ways of understanding the world that are larger than any individual, that persist across generations, that allow the group to survive even when individuals do not. And now, here, tonight, we are the inheritors. We look up at the same stars, though we call them by different names, though we interpret them through different mythologies. We walk across the same earth, though its surface has been reshaped, though the coastlines have shifted, though the forests have retreated and the deserts have expanded. But the connection remains. The continuity remains. We are not separate from our ancestors. We are an extension of them. And the knowledge they carried, the routes they walked, the stars they followed, are still present, still recoverable, if we are willing to look, to listen, to remember. This is not a call to return to some imagined primitivism, to reject modernity in favor of an idealized past. The past was not ideal. It was harsh, uncertain, dangerous. Survival was never guaranteed. But it was real. It was human. And the people who lived through it, who endured, who passed down the knowledge that allowed their descendants to thrive, they deserve to be remembered not as primitives, not as evolutionary stepping stones, but as our equals, as people who faced challenges we can barely imagine and who overcame them through ingenuity, through cooperation, through the accumulation and transmission of knowledge. And if that knowledge included celestial navigation, if it included the encoding of migration routes and star patterns, if it included a sophisticated understanding of geography and astronomy that we are only now beginning to recognize, then that is not a challenge to our modern self-image. It is an affirmation. It is proof that human intelligence, human creativity, human resilience is not a recent development. It is ancient. It is fundamental. It is who we have always been. So look up tonight. Look at the stars, not as abstract objects, not as distant suns burning in the void, but as what they are, as markers, as guideposts, as the memory of journeys taken so long ago that the very shape of the world has changed. And ask yourself, what else have we forgotten? What other knowledge, what other sophistication, what other achievements lie hidden in the deep past, waiting for us to notice, to question, to remember? Because the stars are still there. They have not moved. They are waiting. And perhaps, just perhaps, they have been waiting for us to finally understand what they have been telling us all along. There is a particular quality to this inquiry, a particular emotional texture, that is worth acknowledging before we conclude. It is the sensation of standing at the edge of the known, of peering into the vast, dark expanse of deep time, and feeling both humbled and exhilarated by the realization that we know so little, that the story we tell ourselves about where we came from, about who we are, is provisional, incomplete, always subject to revision as new evidence emerges. This can be unsettling. We crave certainty. We want definitive answers, clear timelines, unambiguous narratives that explain how we got from there to here. But history, real history, deep history, does not offer such comforts. It offers fragments. It offers hints. It offers possibilities that must be weighed, evaluated, integrated into a picture that is always evolving, always incomplete. And that is not a weakness. It is a strength. It is the essence of the scientific method, of the humanistic inquiry, of the relentless pursuit of truth even when truth is elusive, even when it challenges our assumptions, even when it forces us to admit that we were wrong. The idea that ancient star maps might record human migrations from 150,000 years ago is one such challenge. It asks us to reconsider what we think we know about early human cognition. It asks us to take seriously the possibility that oral traditions can preserve information across timescales we once thought impossible. It asks us to acknowledge that vast portions of the human story are inaccessible to conventional archaeology because they are underwater, because they were never written down, because the only record that remains is encoded in myth, in language, in the sky itself. And if we are willing to entertain this possibility, if we are willing to follow the evidence wherever it leads, even if it leads us into uncertain territory, then we open ourselves to a richer, more complex, more awe-inspiring understanding of our own past. Consider what it would mean if this hypothesis were true. It would mean that human beings, our direct ancestors, were not wandering aimlessly across the landscape 150,000 years ago. They were navigating. They were mapping. They were engaged in a conscious, deliberate process of exploration and settlement, guided by accumulated knowledge, by shared understanding, by a system of celestial reference points that allowed them to maintain routes, to transmit information, to ensure that the journeys they undertook could be repeated, could be remembered, could be passed down. It would mean that the dispersal of our species across the planet was not a random process driven purely by environmental pressures and population growth, but a directed process shaped by knowledge, by culture, by the very human capacity to plan, to remember, to connect the past with the future. It would mean that the roots of what we call civilization, the accumulated knowledge, the social complexity, the technological sophistication, extend far deeper into the past than we have been willing to admit. That the gulf between the first humans and modern humans is not as vast as we imagine. That they were, in all the ways that matter, like us. And it would mean that the stars, those distant points of light we gaze at with wonder, with longing, with the perennial human desire to understand our place in the cosmos, have been our companions, our guides, our memory, for as long as we have been human. That the night sky is not just a spectacle, not just a source of aesthetic pleasure, but a map, a record, a living archive of the journeys that made us who we are. This is a profound realization. It connects us, across the immense gulf of time, to every ancestor who ever looked up, who ever wondered, who ever used the stars to find their way. It makes the past feel immediate, present, accessible. It transforms history from a dry recitation of dates and events into something vital, something personal, something that matters now, in this moment, as we stand beneath the same sky and ask the same questions. But let us be clear. This is not a conclusion. This is not a claim that the mystery has been solved, that the evidence is in that we now know for certain that ancient star maps recorded migrations from 150,000 years ago. The evidence is suggestive. The hypothesis is plausible. But much work remains to be done. More research, more analysis, more collaboration between archaeologists, geneticists, astronomers, anthropologists, linguists, and the indigenous knowledge keepers who are the living repositories of the traditions we are attempting to understand. What we have done here is to lay out the case, to present the evidence, to invite you to consider possibilities that lie outside the conventional framework. And if this resonates, if it sparks your curiosity, if it makes you want to learn more, to question more, to look up at the stars with new eyes, then it has served its purpose. Because this is ultimately a story about human potential, about what we are capable of, what we have always been capable of, even in the most challenging circumstances, even in the deep past, when the world was wild and uncertain and survival was never guaranteed. It is a story about resilience, about ingenuity, about the power of knowledge to transcend time, to connect generations, to make the impossible possible. And it is a reminder that we are not separate from that story. We are part of it. We are the latest chapter in a narrative that extends back hundreds of thousands of years, a narrative written not in books but in genes, in languages, in the oral traditions that have been passed down through countless generations, and in the stars themselves which have been watching, guiding, remembering, since the very beginning. So as you drift towards sleep tonight, as your mind begins to wander, to release its grip on the immediate and the concrete, let yourself imagine. Let yourself stand on that ancient beach, beneath that ancient sky, and feel the connection. Feel the continuity. Feel the presence of those who came before, whose journeys made yours possible, whose knowledge is still present, still accessible, if you are willing to look, to listen, to remember. The stars are waiting. They have always been waiting, and perhaps, just perhaps, they have something more to tell us. We return now to the beginning, to the question that opened this exploration. What if the stars you see tonight are not merely distant suns, but markers? What if they record something older, something deeper, than we have been taught to believe? You have journeyed with me through the evidence, through the myths, through the oral traditions that span continents and millennia. You have considered the possibility that human beings 150,000 years ago, perhaps even earlier, were capable of sophisticated celestial navigation, of encoding migration routes in star patterns, of transmitting knowledge across timescales that seem impossible but which, upon closer examination, may not be impossible at all. And now, at the end, we are left not with certainty, but with wonder, with the recognition that the past is not closed, not settled, not fully known, that there are still mysteries waiting to be unraveled, still questions waiting to be asked, still connections waiting to be made between the fragments of evidence that have survived the immense erosions of time. This is not a failing. This is the essence of the human endeavor, the drive to understand, to explore, to push beyond the boundaries of the known into the uncertain, the mysterious, the profound. It is what our ancestors did when they looked up at the stars and saw not just random points of light, but a map, a guide, a way to navigate the vast and unknown world into which they were venturing. And it is what we do now, when we look at the fragmentary evidence they left behind and attempt to reconstruct their journeys, their knowledge, their lives. The star maps, if they exist, if they are real, are not just historical curiosities. They are testaments. They are proof that human intelligence, human creativity, human resilience is ancient and enduring. That the capacity for abstract thought, for symbolic representation, for the transmission of complex knowledge across generations, is not a recent innovation but a fundamental characteristic of our species, present from the very beginning. And if this is true, then it changes how we understand ourselves. It changes the narrative. We are not the culmination of a long, slow climb from primitive ignorance to modern enlightenment. We are, instead, the inheritors of a deep ancient wisdom, a wisdom that has been tested and refined over hundreds of thousands of years, through countless challenges, countless catastrophes, countless moments when survival hung by a thread and the knowledge that had been accumulated, that had been preserved, made the difference. This is a humbling realization. It reminds us that we are not as unique, not as exceptional as we sometimes imagine. Our ancestors were not primitive. They were not simple. They were complex, thoughtful, capable human beings, confronting a world that was in many ways more challenging, more dangerous, more unpredictable than the one we inhabit today. And they survived. They thrived. They spread across the entire planet, adapting to every environment, every climate, every challenge the Earth could throw at them. And they did it, in part, by looking up, by using the one constant, the one reliable reference point in a world of constant change, to guide them, to orient them, to remind them where they had been and where they were going. The stars were their memory, and the stars, patient, unchanging, eternal within the span of human lifetimes, carried that memory forward, generation after generation, until it reached us. What we do with that memory, how we honor it, how we continue the work of exploration and understanding that our ancestors began, is now our responsibility. We have tools they did not have, technologies that allow us to peer into the past with unprecedented precision. We can analyze DNA, reconstruct ancient climates, map submerged coastlines, decode the linguistic structures of oral traditions. We can, if we choose, recover pieces of the story that were lost, that were hidden, that were waiting for us to develop the methods to uncover them. But we can only do this if we are willing to question, to challenge, to look beyond the conventional narratives and ask whether there might be more, whether the fragments we have been ignoring, the oral traditions we have dismissed as myth, the astronomical alignments we have considered coincidence, might actually be pieces of a larger puzzle, a puzzle that, when assembled, reveals a picture of human history far richer, far deeper, far more awe-inspiring than we ever imagined. This is the invitation. This is the call. Not to certainty, not to final answers, but to continued inquiry. To the willingness to sit with the mystery, to embrace the uncertainty, to recognize that the past is not a fixed, known quantity but a living question, always open, always inviting us deeper. And as you lie here, in the dark, on the edge of sleep, let that question settle into you. Let it become part of your dreams, part of your subconscious processing, part of the deeper currents of thought that move beneath the surface of waking consciousness. Because this is how insight comes. Not through force, not through rigid analysis, but through openness, through receptivity, through the willingness to let the mind wander, to let connections form, to let the fragmentary pieces of evidence assemble themselves into patterns that make sense not just logically but intuitively, emotionally, spiritually. The stars have been waiting for 150,000 years. They can wait a little longer, but they are there. And the stories they carry, the routes they mark, the memory they preserve, is not separate from you. It is part of you. It is encoded in your genes, in your language, in the very structure of your brain, which evolved, in part, to navigate, to remember, to use the sky as a guide. You are an inheritor. You are a continuation. You are part of an unbroken chain that extends back to the very dawn of our species, and perhaps beyond. And the stars, those ancient markers, those patient guides, are still performing their function. They are still waiting for you to look up, to recognize, to remember. So sleep well. Dream deeply, and when you wake, perhaps you will see the world, and the sky, and the long arc of human history with new eyes, with the recognition that the past is not behind us. It is within us, and the stars always are still there, guiding us home. There is one final thread we must weave into this tapestry before we allow the silence to settle, before we permit the narrative to dissolve into the gentle rhythms of sleep. It is the question of what we do with knowledge once we recover it. What we do when we recognize that the past was not what we thought it was, that our ancestors were not who we believed them to be, that the narrative we have inherited is incomplete, perhaps even inaccurate in fundamental ways. Do we cling to the old stories, because they are comfortable, because they fit within established paradigms, because challenging them requires effort, risk, the willingness to be wrong? Or do we embrace the uncertainty, the discomfort, the unsettling realization that the ground beneath our feet is less solid than we imagined, and that this instability is not a threat but an opportunity? The history of science, the history of human knowledge, is a history of paradigm shifts, of moments when the accepted framework crumbled and a new one emerged. Copernicus displaced Earth from the center of the cosmos. Darwin connected humans to the animal kingdom. Einstein shattered the Newtonian certainties of absolute space and time. Each of these shifts was resisted, was controversial, was initially met with skepticism and even hostility. But each, in time, was accepted because the evidence became overwhelming, because the new framework explained more than the old one, because it opened new avenues of inquiry that the old framework had closed. We may be at the threshold of such a shift in our understanding of deep human history. The evidence is accumulating. The anomalies are becoming harder to ignore. The oral traditions, once dismissed as mere mythology, are being recognized as potential repositories of genuine historical information. The genetic data is revealing patterns of migration and contact that do not fit comfortably within the timelines we inherited from earlier generations of archaeologists. The underwater surveys are beginning to uncover sites, settlements, evidence of human presence in places and at times that were not supposed to exist. And the stars, always the stars, are waiting. They are the constant, the reference point, the archive that has not been corrupted by time, that has not been erased by floods or fires or the slow erosion of the ages. If we learn to read them, if we learn to connect the patterns in the sky with the patterns in the myths, with the patterns in the genes, with the patterns in the submerged geographies, we may recover knowledge that was lost, that was hidden, that has been waiting for us to develop the tools, the methods, the intellectual courage to uncover it. But this requires something more than just technical skill. It requires humility. It requires the willingness to admit that we do not have all the answers, that the experts are not always right, that the official narrative is provisional, subject to revision, and that the most important breakthroughs often come from the margins, from the people who are willing to ask uncomfortable questions, to pursue unfashionable ideas, to challenge the consensus. It requires also respect. Respect for the oral traditions, for the indigenous knowledge keepers who have preserved these stories across countless generations. Respect for the idea that different ways of knowing, different epistemologies, might offer insights that the scientific method, for all its power, sometimes misses. Respect for the past, for the people who lived through it, who shaped it, who passed down the knowledge that makes our existence possible. And it requires, finally, a sense of wonder, the capacity to be amazed, to be awed, to feel the deep, almost primal thrill that comes from standing at the edge of a great mystery and realizing that the mystery is not something to be feared or avoided, but something to be embraced, explored, honored. Because this is what makes us human. Not our technology, not our cities, not our accumulated wealth or our sophisticated social structures. What makes us human is our curiosity, our drive to understand, our refusal to accept easy answers, our willingness to venture into the unknown in search of truth, even when truth is elusive, even when it challenges everything we thought we knew. The ancient star maps, if they exist, are a testament to this. They are proof that our ancestors, living in a world we can barely imagine, confronting challenges we cannot fully comprehend, still looked up, still wondered, still asked questions, still sought to encode their understanding in forms that could transcend their individual lives, that could be passed down, that could endure. And we are the recipients. We are the ones to whom that knowledge, fragmentary and obscured as it may be, has been passed. And we have a choice. We can ignore it. We can dismiss it as fantasy, as speculation, as the product of overactive imaginations seeing patterns where none exist. Or we can take it seriously. We can investigate. We can test. We can apply the full arsenal of modern scientific methods to the task of determining whether these star maps, these encoded routes, these ancient memories are real. And if they are real, if we can confirm that human beings 150,000 years ago were using the stars to navigate, to map, to remember, then we will have recovered something precious. Not just a piece of historical trivia, not just an interesting footnote in the long saga of human evolution, but a profound insight into who we are, where we came from, what we are capable of. We will have proven that the distance between them and us is not as great as we imagined. That the capacity for wonder, for exploration, for understanding, is ancient. That it has always been part of us. And that when we look up at the stars, when we feel that inexplicable pull, that sense of connection, that feeling that we are seeing something that matters, something that speaks to the deepest parts of ourselves, we are not imagining it. We are remembering. The stars remember. The myths remember. The genes remember. And somewhere, deep within each of us, beneath the layers of modern consciousness, beneath the accumulated distractions and abstractions of contemporary life, we remember too. All we have to do is listen. All we have to do is look up. All we have to do is allow ourselves to feel the connection, to acknowledge the continuity, to recognize that we are not isolated individuals floating in a meaningless void, but part of a story, a vast, ancient, ongoing story that began long before we were born and will continue long after we are gone. And the stars, patient, eternal, unchanging, will continue to mark the path, will continue to guide, will continue to remember, as they always have. And so we arrive at the final moment, the point where the narrative begins to soften, to blur, to merge with the gentle pull of sleep. You have traveled with me across vast distances, across immense spans of time, following the thread of a mystery that may never be fully resolved but which, in its very irresolution, offers something more valuable than certainty. It offers possibility. It offers connection. It offers a sense that the past is not dead, not distant, but alive, present, speaking to us still if only we are willing to listen. The question we began with, the question of whether ancient star maps record human migrations from 150,000 years ago, is not a question that demands a single, definitive answer. It is a question that opens outward, that branches, that leads to other questions, other mysteries, other avenues of exploration. It is a question that invites us to reconsider everything we thought we knew about human history, about cognition, about the transmission of knowledge, about the relationship between myth and reality, between memory and invention. And perhaps, in the end, the value of such questions is not in the answers they provide, but in the journey they inspire, in the willingness to follow the evidence, however fragmentary, however uncertain, wherever it leads, in the courage to challenge the conventional narratives, to question the authorities, to trust in the capacity of human inquiry to uncover truths that have been hidden, forgotten, obscured by time. Because the truth, whatever it may be, is out there. It is encoded in the stars, in the myths, in the genes, in the submerged coastlines, in the oral traditions that have survived against all odds. And we have the tools now to begin recovering it. We have the technology, the methods, the collaborative frameworks that allow us to bring together expertise from multiple disciplines, to cross-reference different types of evidence, to build models that are more comprehensive, more nuanced, more accurate than anything that came before. But we also need something that no technology can provide. We need the willingness to imagine, to empathize, to put ourselves as fully as possible into the experience of those who came before us, to see the world through their eyes, to understand their challenges, their triumphs, their knowledge, their fears. We need to recognize them not as abstractions, not as evolutionary stepping stones, but as people, as individuals with thoughts, feelings, relationships, hopes, dreams, every bit as complex, every bit as valid as our own. And when we do this, when we allow ourselves to truly connect with the deep past, something remarkable happens. The distance collapses. The boundaries dissolve. We recognize that they are us, that there is no fundamental break, no great gulf separating the first humans from the latest. We are a continuity. We are a single, unbroken line extending back to the emergence of our species, and perhaps beyond, back to the ancestors we share with other hominins, back to the very roots of consciousness, of self-awareness, of the capacity to look up at the night sky and ask, what are those lights? Where do they come from? And can they help me find my way? These are the questions that define us. Not our answers, but our questions. The fact that we ask. The fact that we wonder. The fact that we refuse to accept ignorance. That we strive always to understand, to explore, to push beyond the known into the vast, mysterious unknown that surrounds us on all sides. And the stars, those ancient companions, those patient guides, have been part of this journey from the beginning. They have witnessed every step, every migration, every triumph, every catastrophe. They have watched as we emerged from Africa, as we spread across the planet, as we adapted to every environment, every challenge, as we built cultures, languages, civilizations, as we develop technologies that allow us to peer into the deepest reaches of space and time. And they remain constant, unchanging, still marking the paths, still carrying the memory, still waiting for us to look up and remember. So look up, one more time. As sleep begins to take you, as consciousness begins to fade, turn your gaze upward, inward, toward the stars that exist not just in the sky but in your mind, in your memory, in the deep structures of your brain that evolved to navigate, to map, to remember. Feel the connection. Feel the continuity. Feel the presence of all those who came before, whose journeys made yours possible, whose knowledge is still present within you, waiting to be accessed, to be honored, to be continued. You are not alone. You have never been alone. You are part of a story that is larger than any individual life, larger than any single culture, larger than any nation or empire or civilization. You are part of the human story, and the human story is still being written. It is being written in every choice you make, every question you ask, every moment you pause to wonder, to connect, to remember. And the stars are still there. They are always there. And they are not just distant suns burning in the void. They are markers. They are guides. They are the memory of journeys taken so long ago that the earth itself has changed shape, but which are still present, still knowable, still part of who we are. So rest now. Let the questions settle. Let the wonder soften into dreams. And know that when you wake, the stars will still be there. The mystery will still be there. And the journey, the long, ancient, endless journey of human exploration and understanding will continue, as it always has, as it always will, until we finally understand, until we finally remember, until we finally find our way home. And perhaps, just perhaps, we are closer than we think. Sleep well, traveler. The stars are watching, and they remember everything. In the deep hours of the night, when the world is silent and still, when the distractions of the day have faded and the mind is free to wander, there is a particular quality of consciousness that emerges. It is not quite waking, not quite sleeping, but something in between, a state where the boundaries blur, where rational thought gives way to intuition, where the fragments of memory and imagination begin to weave themselves into patterns that feel, somehow, true. This is the state in which the great insights often come. This is where the connections are made that elude the conscious, analytical mind. This is where the deep knowledge, the knowledge that is not learned but remembered, begins to surface. And it is in this state, perhaps, that we can most fully appreciate what it might mean to suggest that ancient star maps record migrations from 150,000 years ago. Not as a dry historical fact, not as an academic proposition to be debated in journals and conferences, but as a living truth, a piece of the human experience that connects us directly, viscerally, to our deepest past. Because memory is not just personal. It is not just the accumulation of individual experiences across a single lifetime. Memory is collective. It is shared. It is encoded not just in neurons but in culture, in language, in ritual, in story. And some memories, the deepest memories, the ones that touch on the fundamental experiences of being human, on birth, death, migration, survival, these memories may be encoded at levels so deep, so foundational, that they persist across not just generations but millennia, not just centuries but hundreds of thousands of years. This is what the oral traditions may be preserving. Not precise, factual accounts of specific events, but the essence, the feeling, the deep truth of what it was like to walk across a world that no longer exists, to follow routes that are now submerged, to navigate by stars that have since shifted in the sky due to the slow wobble of the Earth's axis. The details may have been mythologized, may have been layered over with later interpretations, later meanings. But the core, the lived experience, the memory of looking up and finding your way, that persists. And when we engage with these traditions, when we take them seriously not just as curiosities but as sources of knowledge, we are not just recovering historical information. We are recovering part of ourselves. We are reconnecting with experiences that are, in a very real sense, part of our inheritance, part of what makes us who we are. This is why the study of deep history of the distant past is not just an intellectual exercise. It is a deeply human endeavor. It is about understanding where we came from, how we became what we are capable of. It is about recognizing that the distance between us and our ancestors is not as great as we imagine, that the qualities we value, intelligence, creativity, resilience, compassion, are not modern inventions but ancient traits, tested and refined over unimaginable spans of time. And it is about humility, about recognizing that we are not the pinnacle, not the culmination, but simply the latest expression of a process that began long before us and will continue long after. We are custodians, inheritors, participants in a story that is larger than ourselves. And the more we understand that story, the more we can appreciate our place within it, the more we can honor the contributions of those who came before, and the more responsibly we can act as we shape the future. The stars, in this context, are more than just navigational tools. They are symbols. They represent the continuity, the constancy, the unchanging reference points that allow us to orient ourselves not just in space but in time. They connect us to the past. They remind us that the world we inhabit is not static, not fixed, but constantly changing, and that the only way to navigate change is to have fixed points, reliable references, that transcend the immediate, the temporary, the ephemeral. Our ancestors understood this. They had to. Their survival depended on it. And they encoded this understanding in the most durable, most reliable medium available to them, the sky. And because the sky is constant, because the stars do not decay, do not erode, do not fade, the knowledge they encoded has persisted. It is still there, still accessible, still waiting for us to recognize it, to honor it, to learn from it. And perhaps, in recognizing this, we can begin to shift our relationship with knowledge itself. We live in an age that prizes novelty, innovation, the new. We are constantly looking forward, always seeking the next breakthrough, the next discovery, the next technological leap. And there is value in this. Progress is real. We have achieved things our ancestors could not have imagined. But we have also lost things. We have lost connection. We have lost continuity. We have lost the sense that knowledge is not just something to be created but something to be inherited, to be preserved, to be transmitted with care across generations. We have become, in some ways, unmoored, disconnected from the deep roots that once gave us stability, that once provided meaning, that once connected us to something larger than ourselves. The recovery of ancient knowledge, the recognition that our ancestors were sophisticated, thoughtful, knowledgeable in ways we have underestimated, is not just about correcting the historical record. It is about reconnecting. It is about restoring a sense of continuity, of belonging, of being part of a story that extends far beyond our individual lives, our particular cultures, our specific moment in time. And it is about learning to listen to the stories that have been passed down, to listen to the stars, which are still telling the same stories they told 150,000 years ago, to listen to the deep currents of memory that flow within us, that connect us to the past, that remind us of who we are and where we came from. This is not nostalgia. This is not a romantic longing for a simpler time that never existed. This is recognition. This is acknowledgement. This is the willingness to see the past clearly, to honor it accurately, to learn from it humbly. And it is, perhaps, essential, because the challenges we face now, the questions of how to live sustainably, how to navigate rapid change, how to preserve knowledge, how to maintain connection in an increasingly fragmented world, these are not new questions. They are ancient questions. They are the same questions our ancestors faced. And they found answers. They developed strategies. They created systems of knowledge transmission that worked, that endured, that allowed them not just to survive but to thrive. And we can learn from those strategies. We can adapt them. We can honor the wisdom of the past while embracing the possibilities of the future. We can be both rooted and reaching. We can look up at the stars and see not just the future, not just the vast cosmic distances we dream of exploring, but the past, the ancient journeys, the routes that brought us here. There is a particular story, recorded in the oral traditions of the Dogon people of Mali, that speaks to the deep, unsettling strangeness of ancient astronomical knowledge. The Dogon have long claimed knowledge of Sirius B, the white dwarf companion star to Sirius, which is invisible to the naked eye and was not confirmed by Western astronomy until the mid-20th century. How the Dogon knew of this star has been a subject of intense debate. Skeptics argue contamination from Western astronomers. Believers suggest inheritance of ancient knowledge. But regardless of the specific explanation, the Dogon story points to a broader truth. Oral traditions sometimes contain information that should not be there, that does not fit within our models of how knowledge is transmitted, how it is preserved, how it is verified. And this demands that we take such traditions seriously, that we investigate them rigorously, that we do not dismiss them simply because they are inconvenient or because they challenge our assumptions. The star maps we have been discussing, the encoded routes, the celestial navigation systems embedded in myths from Africa, Australia, the Arctic, the Pacific, these are similar. They are inconvenient. They suggest a level of sophistication, a depth of knowledge, that we have not traditionally attributed to early humans. They force us to reconsider our timelines, our models, our narratives. And that is uncomfortable. But discomfort is not a reason to ignore evidence. It is, in fact, a sign that we may be onto something important, something that requires us to adjust our thinking, to expand our frameworks, to acknowledge that the world and the past are more complex than we imagined. This is the essence of the scientific method, properly understood. Not the rigid application of established protocols, not the defense of existing paradigms against all challenges, but the willingness to follow the evidence, to question assumptions, to revise theories when new data emerges. Science, at its best, is humble. It is flexible. It is open to correction. And when it is not, when it becomes dogmatic, when it defends orthodoxy rather than pursuing truth, it ceases to be science and becomes something else, something less valuable. And so we return one final time to the question, Are these star maps real? Do they truly record migrations from 150,000 years ago? Or are we seeing patterns where none exist, reading meaning into coincidence, projecting our desires for a more interesting past onto fragmentary evidence that does not support such conclusions? The honest answer is that we do not yet know. The evidence is suggestive but not conclusive. The hypothesis is plausible but not proven. More work is needed. More research. More collaboration. More willingness to take the oral traditions seriously, to apply the full arsenal of modern scientific methods to the task of verification, to approach the question with both rigor and openness. But even if the final verdict is inconclusive, even if we never achieve certainty, the journey has been worthwhile. Because we have asked the question. We have examined the evidence. We have allowed ourselves to imagine possibilities that lie outside the conventional framework. And in doing so, we have expanded the boundaries of the knowable. We have made space for new ideas, new approaches, new understandings. And we have honored our ancestors. We have recognized them not as primitives, not as less than, but as fully human, as capable, as thoughtful, as deserving of respect and recognition. We have acknowledged that the story of humanity is deeper, richer, more complex than the simplified narratives we were taught. And we have committed ourselves to the ongoing work of recovering that story, of piecing together the fragments, of listening to the voices that have been speaking to us all along, if only we had the ears to hear. This is the true value of explorations like this. Not the specific conclusions, which may always remain tentative, but the process itself. The willingness to question, the courage to explore, the commitment to understanding. These are the qualities that define us as a species. These are the qualities that allowed our ancestors to navigate a dangerous, uncertain world, to spread across the planet, to build cultures, to create knowledge. And these are the qualities we must preserve, must nurture, must pass down to those who come after us. Because the journey is not over. The exploration continues. There are still mysteries waiting to be solved, still questions waiting to be asked, still connections waiting to be made. The past is not closed. It is open. It is alive. It is calling to us. And how we respond to that call will determine not just our understanding of where we came from, but our capacity to navigate where we are going. The stars have been our guides for as long as we have been human. They have marked our routes, preserved our memories, connected us across vast distances and immense spans of time. And they remain constant, patient, eternal, still performing their function, still waiting for us to look up, to recognize, to remember. So, as you slip deeper into sleep, as the conscious mind releases its grip and the deeper currents of thought take over, let yourself be guided. Let yourself follow the star maps, the encoded routes, the ancient pathways that are still present within you, waiting to be walked. Let yourself connect with the long line of ancestors who came before, who looked up at the same stars, who felt the same wonder, who asked the same questions. And let yourself recognize that you are not just an observer of this story. You are a participant. You are a continuation. You are part of the answer. The stars remember. The myths remember. The genes remember. And deep within, beneath all the layers of modern consciousness, you remember too. You have always remembered. You simply needed permission to acknowledge it, to trust it, to allow it to surface. And now it has surfaced. The question has been asked. The journey has begun. And wherever it leads, whatever we discover, we will have done what humans have always done, what defines us as a species, what connects us to every generation that came before and every generation that will come after. We looked up. We wondered. We sought to understand. And in seeking, we honored the greatest gift our ancestors gave us. The capacity to question, to explore, to reach beyond the known into the vast, mysterious, beautiful unknown. And the stars always are still there, still guiding, still remembering, still waiting for us to come home. In the final stillness, as the narrative dissolves into silence, as the words fade and only the feeling remains, there is a moment of pure connection. A moment when the boundaries between self and other, between past and present, between the individual and the collective, become permeable, transparent, and we glimpse something larger than ourselves. This is the gift of deep history. This is what we gain when we allow ourselves to truly engage with the distant past, to see it not as a collection of dates and artifacts but as a living presence, a set of experiences, of choices, of moments that shaped us, that made us who we are. We gain perspective. We gain humility. We gain a sense of connection that transcends the immediate, the personal, the temporary. And we gain something else, something harder to name but equally valuable. We gain a sense of possibility, a recognition that the world is larger, stranger, more mysterious than we have been taught to believe, that there are still secrets waiting to be uncovered, still knowledge waiting to be recovered, still aspects of our own story that we have not yet fully understood. This is not an invitation to fantasy, to wishful thinking, to the abandonment of rigor or evidence. This is an invitation to openness, to curiosity, to the willingness to consider possibilities that lie outside the comfortable boundaries of established knowledge. This is an invitation to approach the past with the same sense of wonder, the same willingness to be surprised, that we bring to the exploration of the natural world, the cosmos, the depths of the ocean, the heights of the mountains. Because the past is a frontier. It is a territory as vast, as unknown, as any physical landscape. And it is a territory that belongs to us, that is part of our inheritance, that we have a responsibility to explore, to understand, to honor. The ancient star maps, whether they are ultimately confirmed or remain forever in the realm of hypothesis, represent this frontier. They represent the possibility that we have underestimated our ancestors, that we have failed to recognize the depth of their knowledge, the sophistication of their understanding. They represent the idea that the sky has always been more than just a spectacle, more than just a source of aesthetic pleasure. It has been a tool, a library, a map, a memory. And if this is true, if the stars truly do preserve the routes of migrations taken 150,000 years ago, then every time we look up, every time we gaze at the night sky and feel that inexplicable pull, that sense of longing, that feeling that we are seeing something that matters, we are not imagining it. We are responding to something real. We are tapping into a deep, ancient connection that has been part of the human experience from the very beginning. This is what makes us human, not our technology, not our cities, not our accumulated wealth or power. What makes us human is this: the capacity to look up, to wonder, to connect, to remember. The capacity to see beyond the immediate, to reach across time, to honor those who came before and to imagine those who will come after. The capacity to be part of something larger than ourselves. And the stars, those ancient companions, those patient guides, are the perfect symbol of this capacity. They are beyond us. They are indifferent to us. They existed long before we did and will exist long after we are gone. And yet, we have made them part of our story. We have used them to navigate, to measure time, to tell stories, to encode knowledge. We have connected the eternal and the ephemeral, the cosmic and the human, and in doing so, we have created meaning. This is the deepest truth of the star maps, whether they are historical fact or metaphorical insight. They represent the human capacity to create meaning, to impose order on chaos, to connect the disparate, to weave the fragments of experience into coherent narratives that allow us to make sense of the world, to navigate it, to survive in it, to thrive. And this capacity is not diminished by time. It is not less present in us than it was in our ancestors 150,000 years ago. We still look up. We still wonder. We still seek to understand. The tools have changed. The methods have evolved. But the fundamental drive, the fundamental human impulse, remains the same. And so, as you rest here, in the deep silence of the night, as sleep finally claims you, carry this with you. Carry the knowledge that you are part of a story that extends back to the very beginning of our species. Carry the recognition that the stars above you are the same stars that guided your ancestors across continents, across oceans, across the vast, unknown world that they transformed into the familiar, inhabited earth we know today. Carry the sense of connection, of continuity, of belonging to something larger, deeper, more ancient than any single life, any single culture, any single moment in time. And when you dream, let your dreams be filled with stars. Let them be filled with journeys across ancient landscapes, with the sound of waves on forgotten shores, with the feeling of sand beneath your feet on coastlines that no longer exist. Let yourself walk the routes that your ancestors walked, guided by the same celestial markers, following the same paths, connected across the immense gulf of time by the simple act of looking up and seeing not just light, but meaning, not just distance, but connection, not just stars, but home. Because that is what they are. That is what they have always been. Not just distant suns burning in the void, but our guides, our memory, our connection to everything that came before and everything that will come after. They are the constants in a world of change. They are the anchors in a sea of uncertainty. They are the proof that some things endure, that some connections are unbreakable, that the past is not lost but present, always present, waiting for us to recognize it, to honor it, to remember. The journey is complete. The question has been asked. The evidence has been examined. The possibilities have been explored. And now, in the deep silence, in the gentle embrace of sleep, the only thing that remains is the feeling, the wonder, the connection, the recognition that we are not alone, that we have never been alone, that we are part of a long, unbroken line of human beings who have looked up at the stars and found, in their distant light, a reflection of something essential, something true, something that makes us who we are. Sleep now, dream deeply, and remember, the stars are watching, and they will still be there when you wake, as they always have been, as they always will be, guiding us, remembering for us, waiting for us to remember too. And so we arrive finally at the very end. Not with answers, not with certainty, not with the satisfying closure of a mystery solved, but with something more valuable, more enduring. We arrive with awareness, with the recognition that the questions we ask are often more important than the answers we find, with the understanding that the journey itself, the process of exploration, of inquiry, of deep engagement with the mysteries of our past, is where the true value lies. You have traveled far tonight. You have journeyed across continents, across millennia, across the boundaries between the known and the unknown. You have considered possibilities that challenge conventional wisdom, that ask you to see the world, and the past, and your own place within the human story in new ways. And whether you accept these possibilities, whether you find the evidence compelling or remain skeptical, is less important than the fact that you engaged, that you listened, that you allowed yourself to wonder, because wonder is the beginning of wisdom. It is the state of mind that makes learning possible, that makes discovery possible, that makes growth possible. When we stop wondering, when we become complacent, when we assume that we already know everything worth knowing, we stop growing. We stop learning. We become static, fixed, closed to the new, the unexpected, the transformative. Our ancestors never stopped wondering. They could not afford to. Every day was a challenge. Every season brought new uncertainties, and survival depended on the constant, active engagement with the world, on the willingness to observe, to adapt, to learn, to remember. And they passed this capacity down to us, encoded not just in our genes but in our cultures, in our languages, in the stories we tell, in the way we look up at the night sky and feel something stirring, something ancient, something that connects us to every human being who has ever lived. The star maps, the encoded routes, the celestial navigation systems embedded in oral traditions around the world, these are testaments to that capacity. They are proof that our ancestors were not passive, not primitive, not limited in their ability to think, to plan, to create systems of knowledge that could endure across unimaginable spans of time. They were us, and we are them, and the line that connects us is unbroken, continuous, alive. So as you finally surrender to sleep, as the last threads of conscious thought dissolve into the deeper currents of dreaming, take with you this final gift, the gift of connection, the gift of recognition, the gift of knowing that you are part of something larger, older, more profound than you ever imagined. You are not a solitary individual adrift in a meaningless universe. You are a continuation, an inheritor, a participant in the greatest story ever told, the story of humanity itself. And the stars, those ancient markers, those patient guides, those silent witnesses to every triumph and every tragedy, every journey and every homecoming, they are still there. They are always there. And they are not just distant suns burning in the cosmic void. They are your inheritance. They are your connection. They are the memory of every ancestor who walked beneath them, who used them to find their way, who passed down the knowledge that allowed you, ultimately, to be here, now, in this moment, asking these questions, seeking these answers, continuing the journey. The journey that has no end. The journey that is the very essence of what it means to be human. The journey outward into the world and inward into the self. The journey forward into the future and backward into the past. The journey that began when the first human looked up at the night sky and asked, "What are those lights?" And that continues now, tonight, in you, as you ask, "What do those lights remember?" And the answer, whispered across 150,000 years, carried in the stories, encoded in the myths, preserved in the oral traditions, is this: they remember you. They remember all of us. They remember the journeys, the migrations, the routes walked by countless generations, the knowledge passed down, the wonder preserved. They remember because we made them remember. We used them as our memory, our map, our guide. And they have not forgotten. So neither should we. We should remember. We should honor. We should continue the work of exploration, of understanding, of connection. We should look up at the stars and see not just distant objects but part of ourselves, part of our story, part of the vast, ancient, ongoing human experience. And we should pass it down. We should tell the stories. We should teach the young to look up, to wonder, to ask questions, to seek answers, to honor the past while embracing the future. We should be the link, the connection, the living thread that ties the deep past to the unknown future. Because that is our role. That is our responsibility. That is what it means to be human in this moment, in this time, with the knowledge we possess, the tools we have developed, the understanding we have gained. We are the custodians. We are the inheritors. We are the ones who must choose whether to remember or to forget, whether to honor or to ignore, whether to continue the journey or to let it end. And the choice is simple. Look up. Remember. Continue. The stars are waiting. They have always been waiting, and they will guide you, as they have guided every human being who ever walked the earth, as they guided your ancestors across continents and oceans, across time itself. Home is not a place. Home is a direction, and the stars know the way. They have always known, and they are showing you now, if only you will see, if only you will remember, if only you will allow yourself to feel the connection, deep and ancient and true, that ties you to everything that came before and everything that will come after. The stars remember, and so must we, always, forever, until the journey is complete, until we find our way home, together, guided by the light of stars that have been waiting patiently for 150,000 years, waiting for us to remember, waiting for us to return, waiting for us to finally understand what they have been telling us all along, that we are not lost, that we never were, that the map has always been there, written in light, waiting to be read. And now, finally, we are beginning to see, to understand, to remember, and the stars at last can rest. Their work is done. The message has been delivered. We are home.